Good evening and welcome. Tonight we're going to be continuing our reading from the Atlas Obscura. We're going to keep reading from this chapter. Let me flip to here. So we're going to read Cyprus, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, and Switzerland. I tried to get through all this in the first part, but my phone started to die, so it's a little longer than I thought it would be, but it's not a bad thing to have a long, relaxing ASMR video. So let's continue where we left off. We're going to read about Cyprus first, at the Varosha Beach Resort in Famagusta. Turquoise water, golden beaches, and signs illustrated with a gun-toting soldier that read Forbidden Zone. This is the resort town of Varosha. There's the sign. Since 1974, the northern and southern parts of Cyprus have been divided by the Green Line, a UN buffer zone that splits the country into the Greek-controlled south and the Turkish-controlled north. The division happened amid much violence. After the Greek military junta backed a coup against the Cypriot government, Turkey invaded Cyprus from the north, forcibly expelling hundreds of thousands of Greek Cypriots and driving them south. Turkish Cypriots in the south abandoned their homes and headed north. In the early 70s, Famagusta, a town 2 miles north of the Green Line, was the top tourist destination in Cyprus. Its beachside Varosha quarter, dotted with high-rise hotels, played host to moneyed movie stars like Elizabeth Taylor and Brigitte Bardot. In the wake of the Turkish invasion, its 39,000 residents fled, and Varosha became a ghost town. It has remained enclosed in barbed wire, uninhabited, and under the control of the Turkish military ever since. Left unmaintained for decades, buildings are slowly collapsing. Just a few feet north of the fenced-off zone is the Arkin Palm Beach Hotel, a newly renovated resort where visitors can sip Caribbean-inspired cocktails beside the lagoon-shaped pool while gazing at the crumbling balconies of the decayed resort next door. Moving on to Italy, we have Villa de Vecchi in Cortinova. Just east of Lake Como, at the foot of the forested mountains of Cortinova, sits a house that's said to be haunted. Villa de Vecchi, also called the Red House, Ghost Mansion, and Casa delle Streghe, or House of the Witches, was built between 1854 and 1857 as a summer residence for Count Felix de Vecchi. Within a few short years of its completion, the house witnessed an inexplicable string of tragedies that would forever cement its Gothic legacy. De Vecchi, the head of the Italian National Guard and a decorated hero, set out to build a dream retreat for his family with the help of architect Alessandro Sidoli. A year before the villa was complete, Sidoli died. Many would later view this as the first ill omen. Nevertheless, the Count and his family made Villa de Vecchi their home during the spring and summer months, and by most accounts led an idyllic, if brief, existence. The great mansion boasted a blend of Baroque and classical Eastern styles, and was outfitted with all the modern conveniences of the time, including indoor heating pipes and painstakingly detailed frescoes and friezes. A larger-than-life fireplace presided over the main parlor, where a grand piano stood at the ready. Extensive gardens, promenades, and an equally impressive staff house rounded out the already picturesque surroundings. Legend has it that in 1862 the Count returned home to find his wife murdered and daughter missing. The Count commandeered a lengthy, unsuccessful search for his daughter before dying by taking his life that same year. The house made the rounds of owners and prospective buyers, but by the 1960s was left permanently uninhabited. While the natural elements began their assault early on, the majority of the abandoned house's irreversible damage has been done by humans. Graffiti covers the walls, and anything capable of being vandalized has been given its due makeover. The grand piano, once said to be played at night by a ghostly entity, has since been smashed to pieces, though some locals claim that music can still be heard coming from the house. Ooh. Next we have the Underground temples of Damanhur in Baldissero Canavesi in Piedmont. From 1978 to 1992, members of the Damanhur commune dug into the mountain where they lived, tapping into what they believed were energy lines connecting the earth to the cosmos. Their excavations were done in secret. Having neglected to secure planning approval, they had to conceal their work from authorities, but the world would eventually find out. Led by philosopher, writer, and painter Oberto Airaudi, the Eco Society of Damanhur began in 1975 with about 24 members. Billing itself as the laboratory for the future of humanity, Damanhur is based on neo-pagan and New Age beliefs with emphasis on creative expression, meditation, and spiritual healing. Residents adopt animal and plant names such as sparrow pinecone and live in nucleo communities of 20 people in the foothills of the Alps, 30 miles north of Turin. Some former members have railed against Damanhur's sunny-spirited collective, describing it as a cult. It was an ex-Damanhurian who tipped off police about the unauthorized underground construction. When 3 officers and a public prosecutor arrived to conduct an early morning raid, they were astonished. Beneath the humble farmhouse, behind a secret door, was a collection of temples spanning 5 levels. Damanhur citizens had spent a decade and a half working around the clock in shifts to excavate 8,500 cubic meters of earth and rock. They decorated each hall and hallway in a different theme, with murals, stained glass windows, mirrors, and mosaics. The New Age 1970s style artwork depicts everything from the history of the universe to a forest of endangered animals to the International Space Station. Check this out. The perimeter of one of the circular rooms is cluttered with sculptures due to the directive that each member of the community must carve a statue in their own likeness. Boggled by the unexpected beauty of the subterranean halls, Italian police granted a retroactive construction permit. The Eco Society, which currently numbers around 1,000 members, now welcomes visitors to its temples. So, check this out. This is the ground. There's the house. Look at this. That's so massive. Let's see. This is the Hall of Earth, which is down here. Look at it. Wow. Impressive. Next is Poveglia Island in Venice, Veneto. The first challenge to visiting Poveglia is finding someone to take you there. It won't be easy. Poveglia, an island just south of Venice, is strictly off the limits for both locals and tourists. Given the island's history, you'll understand why. For much of its history, Poveglia was a dumping ground for the diseased, the dying, and the mentally ill. In the early 15th century, it functioned as a quarantine island. Those afflicted by one of the many Black Death plagues over the years were taken to the island, along with disease-ridden corpses. The living shivered and vomited blood, while the hundreds of dead were thrown into plague pits and burned. The remains of an estimated 160,000 people are mixed into the island's soil. In 1922, a psychiatric hospital opened on the island. Legend holds that one of the doctors, a sadistic man fond of experimenting on his patients, threw himself off the bell tower after being haunted by the spirits of those who had died on the island. In some versions of the story, he is thrown off the tower, presumably by a vengeful patient. The hospital building, which closed in 1968, is still on Poveglia, covered in scaffolding and colonized by trees. Rusting bed frames, rotting wood beams, and pieces of the ceiling litter the floors. In the bushes surrounding the hospital are the rectangular metal grates that were once fastened to every window to keep patients trapped in their rooms. Very spooky place. Next are the wooden books of Padua University and San Vito di Cadore, Veneto. Each book in this 56-volume collection tells the story of a particular tree, not in words or illustrations, but with parts of the tree itself. The wooden books of Padua University date from the late 1700s and early 1800s. While most books are made from wood, pulped into paper, these are different. The back and front covers are made from the tree's wood, its spine made of the tree's bark. Inside are samples of the tree's leaves, twigs, flowers, seeds, and roots. Each book is accompanied by a handwritten piece of parchment with a key explaining the contents. Next is La Specola in Florence, Tuscany. In 18th century Florence, artists created wax anatomical models to show medical students what lay beneath the skin of the human body. The model-making process was labor-intensive and began with an artist pressing plaster against the individual organs of a recently dissected cadaver to create a cast. Wax was poured into the molds, and each organ painted and varnished. All the body parts were then assembled into a wax torso and overlaid with muscles and membranes, which were either simulated with thread or painted on. The works were so uncannily realistic, red, glistening muscles lying taut against knobby bones, encased in an intricate web of veins, that it was felt the artistry deserved a wider audience. In 1775, the figures were put on display at La Specola, a natural history and zoology museum established by the Medici family. Over several generations, the Medicis amassed a vast quantity of fossils, minerals, animals, and plants. When La Specola opened, it became the first publicly accessible science museum in Europe. It featured consistent hours of operation, tour guides, and guards. Today, La Specola contains 34 rooms, filled with human and animal wax models, zoological specimen taxidermy, and medical instruments. Particularly compelling are the wax anatomical Venuses, naked women posed in demure but erotic poses, with their abdominal skin removed and rib cages pulled open to expose the organs underneath. The Marquis de Sade, who harbored a taste for sexual violence, had a particular fondness for these sensuous, gutted female forms. Next is Galileo's middle finger in Florence, Tuscany. It's hard to think of a more fitting tribute to the ever-defiant Galileo than displaying his middle finger in a goblet accented with gold. 95 years after Galileo's death in 1642, Anton Francesco Gori, a Florentine priest and scholar, pocketed the astronomer's finger while transporting his remains from their humble original grave to a monumental tomb. The relic was exhibited at Florence's Laurentian Library until 1841, when the town's Natural History Museum, also home to the Anatomical and Zoological Museum La Specola, snatched it up for display. In 1927, the finger landed at its current resting place, a museum devoted to scientific instruments that was renamed the Galileo Museum in 2010. The middle digit is the only human fragment among the institution's telescopes, meteorological instruments, and mathematical models. It is mounted vertically in a goblet on a column with a commemorative inscription. This is the finger belonging to the illustrious hand that ran through the skies, pointing at the immense spaces and singling out new stars. Whether the middle finger points upward to the sky, where Galileo glimpsed the glory of the universe and saw God in mathematics, or if it sits eternally defiant to the church that condemned him, is for the viewer to decide. Next is Pope Leo's bathroom in the Holy See in Rome. In 1516, Cardinal Bibbiena, a longtime friend and confidant to Pope Leo X, decided to redecorate the bathroom within the Vatican's papal apartments. Bibbiena's predilection for the ribald and the risque inspired him to commission a series of erotic frescoes by another close friend, the artist Raphael. The panels depict Venus, Cupid, nymphs, and satyrs, all cavorting naked in the wild. The ensuing centuries have brought censorship to the Stufetta de Cardinal Bibbiena, translated as the small heated room of Cardinal Bibbiena. Scandalized residents of the papal apartments painted over sections of the artwork. A few of the panels remaining depict the naked Venus swimming, looking at herself in a mirror, and reclining between the legs of Adonis. Though it wouldn't be sanctioned by today's papal apartment decorators, Raphael's erotic artwork was tame compared to the famed licentiousness of the Renaissance popes. Pope Alexander VI's Banquet of Chestnuts, which took place in the papal palace in 1501, is an example of the behavior that occurred within the Vatican walls. During the event, the Pope brought in 50 women, auctioned off their clothing, and made them crawl naked on the floor to pick up chestnuts he and his guests had thrown. It was a weird time. Members of the clergy and party guests were then encouraged to have sex with the women. The man who carried out the most conquest received the prize of clothing and jewels. It's definitely a different time. Moving on to the Park of the Monsters in Bomarzo, Lazio. The stone sculptures of the Parco dei Monstri emerged from the tormented mind of 16th century Italian prince Pier Francesco Orsini. Pier endured a brutal war, saw his friend killed, was held for ransom for years, and returned home only to have his beloved wife die. Seeking a way to express his grief, Orsini hired architect Piero Ligorio to create a park that would shock and frighten its visitors. The park exhibits the 16th century Mannerist style, an artistic approach that rejected the Renaissance's elegance and harmony in favor of exaggerated, often tortured expressions, and a mishmash of mythological, classical, and religious influences. Its wretched sculptures, including a war elephant attacking a Roman soldier, a monstrous fish head, a giant tearing another giant in half, and a house built on a tilt to disorient the viewer, caught the attention of Salvador Dali, who visited in 1948 and found much to inspire his surrealist artwork. A trip to the park is not complete without a walk up the stone stairs leading into the mouth of hell, the face of an ogre captured mid-scream. Walk into its gaping maw inscribed with "All reason departs," and you'll find a picnic table with benches. Very interesting. Next is the Passetto di Borgo in Rome, which you can see over here in this picture. To the casual eye, the Passetto di Borgo looks like a plain old fortification, but its stone walls hide a passageway that several popes have used as an emergency escape route. Construction of the wall dates back to 850, with Pope Nicholas III overseeing the creation of its current form in 1277. Pope Alexander VI finished the wall in 1492, and just in the nick of time, he used it to flee the invading French only 2 years later. The most recent papal escape was in 1527, when Clement VII evaded the 20,000 mutinous troops of Charles V, who murdered most of the Swiss guard on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. Since then, the Passetto had languished in declining condition, closed to visitors but available to the reigning pope in case of a crisis. But in 2000, in honor of the Pope's Jubilee year, the Passetto was renovated. It now opens to visitors for a limited time each summer. Moving on to the Museum of Holy Souls in Purgatory in Rome. This small collection of hand-shaped burns imprinted onto prayer books, bed sheets, and clothing offers purported proof of communication between the dead and the living. According to Catholic doctrine, the souls of the dead are stranded in purgatory until they atone for their sins. Their ascent to heaven can be hastened, however, through the prayers of the friends and family they have left behind. Victor Jouet, founder of Rome's Church of the Sacred Heart, was supposedly inspired to build this purgatorial museum after a fire destroyed a portion of the church in 1898, leaving behind the scorched image of a face that he believed to be a trapped soul. The collection of hand marks, which mostly date from the 18th and 19th centuries, are presented as the earthly manifestations of trapped souls reaching out from purgatory, pleading that their loved ones pray harder. Next is the Secret Cabinet of Erotica in Naples, Campania. And if you've been at all shocked about any unsettling viewer discretion advised topic so far, you might want to skip to the next one because this one's pretty alert. I mean, it is a Secret Cabinet of Erotica in Naples. Citizens of Pompeii and Herculaneum believed phalluses provided protection, prosperity, and good luck, and incorporated them into everything from furniture to oil lamps. Frescoes on the walls of homes depicted erotic encounters between wood nymphs and satyrs. Erotica was everywhere. After the excavation of Pompeii and Herculaneum in the 19th century, the sexy objets were put on display at the National Archaeological Museum of Naples. But when the future king of the Two Sicilies, Francis I, visited with his wife and young daughter in 1819, he was shocked by all the erotica. He ordered all the explicit items removed from view and locked in a secret cabinet, where access could be restricted to mature gentlemen of high moral standing. All this fuss only served to make the collection more famous. The whispered about secret collection became a must-see for gentlemen during their grand tours of Europe. It remained off-limits to women, children, and the general public. For a century and a half, the Gabinetto Segreto stayed out of sight, on view only during brief, liberal periods under radical 19th century General Giuseppe Garibaldi, and again in the 1960s. The Gabinetto Segreto was finally opened to the public in 2000 and moved into a separate gallery in 2005. Among dozens of stone penises, phallic wind chimes, and naughty mosaics, one item became the most notorious: the satyr and the goat. It is a detailed carving of a satyr in flagrante delicto with a female goat, her cloven feet pressed up against his chest as he gazes at him demurely. Anyway. Next is Civita di Bagnoregio in Civita. The small town of Civita di Bagnoregio has survived for centuries, clinging to its high perch. But as the soft clay on the edges of towny roads, its architecture is being lost. Etruscans first built this tiny town on a tall column of volcanic rock over 2,500 years ago. Civita was accessible via a slim donkey path that led to the arch, marking its only entrance. Over the centuries, the borders of the circular town became flush with the edges of the plateau, as the tightly packed architecture filled the limited space atop the column. All the while, natural disasters weakened the clay foundations, which were already prone to erosion. In the 20th century, many of Civita's thousands of residents began to move to more stable areas. Today, the donkey path has finally eroded away, and the only way to get to the village is via a steep footbridge. Supplies only make it up there via moped or three-wheeled ape, or bees, tiny motorized pickup trucks. The population reaches about 100 during the summer months and drops into the single digits during winter. In 2013, the town began charging visitors an entry fee. Tourism has been profitable for the townspeople, but regular landslides continue to reduce the town's borders. Very beautiful, but very sad, actually. That's disappearing. Next are the Capuchin catacombs in Palermo, Sicily, which, yes, these are skeletons. 8,000 corpses in various states of decay inhabit the musty, ill-lit Capuchin catacombs of Palermo. Originally intended exclusively for monks, the passageways were expanded over time to make room for prominent locals who paid to be buried in the holy vaults. Separated according to age, sex, occupation, and social status, the mummified bodies are arranged in open coffins, hung from the walls in narrow corridors, and piled on shelves. In the Chapel of the Virgins, girls whose families declared them virgins are displayed in faded and tattered white dresses under the inscription, "We follow the Lamb wherever he goes. We are virgins." They wear their best clothes, but their appearance is marred by caved-in noses, empty eye sockets, and sunken cheeks. Many have wide-open mouths due to a combination of decomposing facial ligaments and gravity, making them look as though they are silently screaming. The particularly dry atmosphere of the catacombs facilitated the natural mummification of the bodies. Priests would lay the dead on shelves and allow them to drip until they were completely depleted of bodily fluids. When a year had passed, they would rinse the dried-out corpses with vinegar before redressing them in their best attire and sending them to their designated eternal room. The oldest corpse in the collection is that of Silvestro da Gubbio, a friar who passed in 1599. The most recent, Rosalia Lombardo, was only 2 years old when she was embalmed in 1920 after dying of pneumonia. The embalming procedure has kept Rosalia looking so well preserved that she has been dubbed Sleeping Beauty. The catacombs also serve as a macabre history of fashion museum, charting the rise and fall of Palermo high style from the 1600s to the 1920s. Though the mummies once sported glass eyes, they disappeared during World War II when American GIs came through town and plucked them out as souvenirs. Moving on to the Netherlands. Here's the Taylor's Museum, Tyler's, in Haarlem, North Holland. I'm still terrible at Dutch, you guys. Lit only by sunlight since it opened in 1784, Taylor's Museum is the first and oldest museum in the Netherlands. Its core collection of fossils, paintings, and scientific instruments were originally a cabinet of curiosities belonging to Peter Taylor van der Hulst, a Haarlem banker and silk manufacturer. In his will, the Enlightenment-era thinker decreed that his money be used to establish a foundation for science and the arts. This museum is the glorious result. The current collection includes 25 Michelangelo artworks, drawings by Rembrandt, fossils, beautifully illustrated 18th century natural history books, coins from the 1600s, and the world's largest electrostatic generator. Its main building, an airy oval-shaped room with lofty glass-vaulted ceilings, is as eye-catching as the curiosities within. Next is the Eisinge Planetarium in Franeker, Friesland, which is a really cool picture of it up here. But let's read this. Dutch priest Ilko Alta induced mass panic in 1774 when he predicted that an upcoming alignment of the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, and Jupiter would send Earth hurtling into the Sun. To calm the widespread fear and to demonstrate the varying speeds of the solar system's orbits, amateur astronomer Isa Eisinge installed a planetarium in his living room ceiling. It has been operating ever since, making it the oldest functional planetarium in the world. Construction took 7 years. Eisinge carved the era's 6 known planets, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, out of wood, painted them gold, and suspended them from the ceiling. A pendulum sends the planets traveling in real time in concentric orbits around a painted sun. The ceiling is painted cerulean blue to represent the sky and shows zodiac constellations and the points at which each planet is farthest from the sun. Hidden in the roof space above the ceiling are 60 wheels and gears that keep the whole thing moving. Just as Eisinge was putting the finishing touches on his planetarium in 1781, scientists made a discovery, Uranus. But the astronomer did not alter his creation, as adding the planet would have destroyed the planetarium's 1 by 1012 scale. That's a very beautiful planetarium. That would be really cool to see, actually. Next is Giethorn. Giethorn Overijssel. With its thatched cottages, narrow canals, and 180 wooden bridges, the village of Giethorn, population 2,600, is a tiny, bucolic version of Venice. The village got its canals during the 16th century when the inhabitants began digging troughs to extract peat for fuel. The resulting 4 miles of waterways, along with the adjacent footpaths, constitute Giethorn's transport network. The village has no roads, so all travel is via boat or bike or on foot. The preferred way to ride along the canals is by whisper boats, whose motors are quiet enough to maintain the tranquil atmosphere. And next is the Electric Ladyland Museum of Fluorescent Art in Amsterdam. In a small, dark basement, just a 5-minute walk from the Anne Frank house, is a museum as psychedelic as the Jimi Hendrix album of the same name. The Electric Ladyland Museum of Fluorescent Art begins with a walk through a neon-accented, participatory environment where the walls glow when the lights go off. Then comes the cabinet of fluorescent minerals. These gray lumps of rock turn brilliant colors when viewed under an ultraviolet bulb. Museum founder Nick Padalino will gladly talk you through the many kinds of fluorescence being demonstrated under the varying wavelengths of light. Most surprising is the display of common items such as coconuts, seashells, depression-era glass, and lentils rendered in glowing fluorescent hues. It's interesting. Next is Micropia in Amsterdam. Interesting. Micropia is a zoo with a small difference. The creatures it keeps are invisible to the naked eye. Established in 2014, Micropia sheds light on the molds, yeasts, bacteria, viruses, and other microorganisms that are ever present but go largely unnoticed. The Meet Your Microbes exhibit highlights a few of the 100 trillion microorganisms living in and around your body, while the Kissing exhibit ratchets up the romance by illustrating the massive exchange of bacteria that occurs when two people make out. Alright, moving on to Portugal, we have the boulders of Monsanto. Check it out. This is in Monsanto in Idana Nova. The hillside medieval village of Monsanto was built around a pile of massive granite boulders. The placement of the rocks determined the shapes of the winding streets and the architecture of the stone houses. Instead of trying to move the boulders, the villagers used them as walls, floors, and even roofs. From a distance, some of the houses look like they've been crushed by giant falling rocks. Other than the odd plastic chair and air conditioning unit, Monsanto has retained its medieval appearance. It is now home to about 800 people. There are no cars. The preferred mode of transport through the narrow cobbled streets is donkey. It's very charming. Next is the Quinta de Regalier. I'm not good at Portuguese either. This is in Sintra in Grande Lisboa. Eccentric millionaire Antonio Augusto Carvalho Monteiro designed the palace in 1904 as a monument to his diverse interests and secret affiliations. The 5-story hilltop mansion mixes Roman, Gothic, Renaissance, and Manueline styles. Its surrounding gardens are a fantasy land of grottos, fountains, statues, ponds, underground tunnels, and a deep, moss-covered initiation well believed to be the former site of Masonic rituals. The architecture hides shapes and symbols relating to alchemy, masonry, the Knights Templar, and the Rosicrucians. A Roman Catholic chapel in front of the palace depicts Catholic saints, but also pentagrams, which are often used in occult religions. Next is the Mafra Palace Library in Mafra. The magnificent library within the 18th century Palace of Mafra is a national architectural treasure, and it ranks among the finest libraries in Europe. It is also home to a colony of bats that patrol the stacks each night in search of book-eating pests. The wooden shelves of the Rococo-style library are lined with thousands of valuable old volumes. These books are fragile, however, and bookworms, moths, and other insects can wreak havoc on their delicate pages. Most libraries control such pests with more traditional techniques like fumigation or irradiation, but the Mafra Palace Library deploys its own very special force of winged protectors. During the day, the bats sleep behind the bookcases or out in the palace garden. Then at night, after the library has closed, these tiny flying mammals swoop between the stacks, hunting down book-eating bugs. This nocturnal feasting has been going on for centuries, perhaps as far back as the creation of the library itself. The bats, however, do come with one disadvantage: the copious covering of droppings they expend upon the floors, shelves, and furniture each and every night. To combat this, library workers cover the furniture before they leave and spend their mornings carefully cleaning the marble floors to erase all evidence of the previous night's excreta. Next is the preserved head of Diogo Alves in Lisbon. The head of a 19th century Portuguese serial killer is alarmingly well preserved in a jar at the University of Lisbon. Upon entering the anatomical theater at the Faculty of Medicine, the first thing you'll notice is the lone pickled head up on a shelf next to a diaphanized hand. It's yellow, peaceful looking, and somewhat akin to a potato. decapitates the head of Diogo Alves, whose claims to fame include being both Portugal's first serial killer and the last man to be hanged. At least one half of each claim is true. Alves was a serial killer indeed, but not the first, and he was not the last man to be executed. At least 6 more followed him to the gallows before Portugal ruled out capital punishment. So why then is Alves's head in a jar? Timing, most likely. Alves was executed in 1841, as phrenology was just beginning to rear its ugly head in Portugal. Today we recognize phrenology as a pseudoscience, but at the time people believed that personality traits, criminal propensity included, could be felt and measured right on the individual's skull. It's no surprise then that a notoriously wicked corpse would draw the attention of Portugal's budding band of phrenologists, who requested Alves's head to be severed and preserved for posterity, so the source of his criminal urges could be studied in depth. Moving on to Spain, we have Don Justo's self-built cathedral in Mejorada del Campo in Madrid. Don Justo Gallego Martinez, a former monk with no experience in architecture, construction, or engineering, has been building this cathedral out of recycled and donated materials since 1961. There has never been a formal plan for the building. The design is influenced by St. Peter's Basilica, but has changed over the years according to Don Justo's shifting inspirations. The project began when Don Justo contracted tuberculosis and had to leave the monastic order. With his health in a perilous state, he prayed to the Virgin Mary and vowed to create a shrine in her honor should he survive. Though he never received an official construction permit, the recovered Don Justo devoted himself to building a church that now stands 13 stories tall. Oil drums, paint buckets, scrap metal, and bricks salvaged from a nearby brick factory are all pasted together with thick layers of concrete to form the walls and spires. Don Justo receives occasional assistance from his nephews and volunteers, but the bulk of the work is done with his own hands. The cathedral is about 10 to 15 years away from completion, a problem considering its chief builder is in his 90s. The fate of the building is up in the air. As an unapproved construction, it could well be razed, eliminating the life's work of a most determined man. Next is the cliff-top city of Ronda. The city of Ronda is perched high atop the 2 cliffs of El Tajo Canyon, as though a fissure opened and swallowed its center. Romans established a settlement at Ronda nearly 2 centuries before the reign of Julius Caesar, and it has since survived through several invading forces. The walls of the canyon are sheer drops to the Guadalevin River over 330 feet below. That's more than the height of the Statue of Liberty and her pedestal. Ronda's white stone buildings teeter on the very edge of the chasm. Connecting the 2 parts of the city are 3 bridges, the Roman Bridge, the Arab Bridge, and the New Bridge. The first 2 are so called to recognize the regimes that built them. The not-so-new bridge was completed in 1793 by the town's Spanish inhabitants. The bridges are impressive feats of stonework with ornate roofs above and massive columns that reach down into the canyon. It is neat. Next is the Baby Jumping Festival in Castrillo de Murcia in Castile and Leon. Every year, 60 days after Easter, the village of Castrillo de Murcia invites men dressed as devils to leap over some babies. The annual Baby Jumping Festival takes place in the streets, where infants are laid out on mattresses in rows of 2 or 3. As the babies fidget and squirm in front of an audience gathered on the sidewalks, men dressed in bright yellow suits and devilish masks come charging down the street. They threaten bystanders with whips and act in a menacing manner before jumping over the rows of infants as though they were hurdles on a running track. Dating back to the 17th century, the festival is intended to absolve infants of evil. Any child born within the last year is eligible to serve as a human hurdle for the devilment. Next is El Caminito del Rey in El Chorro, Malaga. Check that out. Oof. Until its renovation in 2015, El Caminito del Rey was the most dangerous stroll in Spain. a 3-foot wide concrete path along the steep walls of the El Chorro Gorge, 350 feet above ground and over a century old, was riddled with large, ragged holes. In some sections, the concrete had completely fallen away, leaving only the 3-inch wide steel supporting beams. Mountain climbers and hikers would come here for the ultimate thrill, inching along the beams in windy conditions and trying not to look down. The pathway was built in 1901 to provide a faster commute for workers at the nearby hydroelectric plant. 20 years after the pathway was completed, King Alfonso XIII crossed it for the inauguration of a new dam. This led to the pathway's modern name, the King's Little Pathway, or El Caminito del Rey. Soon after the King's Crossing, however, the structure fell into disrepair. Having recognized the perilous nature of the path, 3 men fell to their deaths in 2000. The local government began restoring it in 2014, laying down a new trail and adding handrails. Though the pathway no longer presents a potentially lethal challenge to hikers, it is just as thrilling to stand on, especially when the wind picks up. Next is the Whistling Island in La Gomera, the Canary Islands. The whistles that echo across the valleys of La Gomera are not mere noise, but conversation. The tiny island's inhabitants speak to one another in Silbo, a wordless language that relies on pitch variation to communicate meaning. Silbo originates with the Guanches, the first inhabitants of La Gomera, who spoke a tonal language with a simple structure. When Spanish settlers arrived in the 16th century, the Guanches adapted their simple Silbo to the Spanish dialect, creating the more complex version that is used today. To non-Silbo speakers, the sound is like birdsong. More distinctive is the method of speaking. Gomerans insert a finger or a knuckle of one hand into their mouths to make the sounds, while the other hand cups the side of the face to focus sound in the direction of the listener. Fearing the extinction of the language, Gomerans made Silbo a mandatory part of the island's elementary school curriculum in 1999. Moving on to Switzerland, we have the Bruno Weber Sculpture Park in Dietschon, Aargau. This park of monsters and mythical creatures is a glimpse into the marvelous mind of Bruno Weber. The Swiss sculptor began building his collection of oversized exotic animals in 1962 to celebrate the power of imagination in his increasingly modernized hometown of Dietschon. Serpents, winged dogs, caterpillars, and mythological creatures surround a Gothic fairy tale castle with an 82-foot tower, home to Weber and his wife, Marianne Godin, for decades. When he was 75, Weber spoke of his plans to build a water garden in the park, a playful place with mosaic-coated sculptures, a rooster, fountains, and ponds that would provide the finishing touch. Unfortunately, he died in 2011 at the age of 80, unable to complete his final flourish. Picking up his designs, Godin stepped in and finished the garden. It opened to the public 6 months after Weber's death. It's very beautiful. This not so much. This is the Child Eater of Bern. Atop a blue and gold column in the middle of Bern sits an ogre, his jaw gaping and teeth bared as he happily eats a baby. He is Kindelfresser, the Child Eater. And hoisting his sack of ready-to-eat babies, he forms the centerpiece of one of the oldest fountains in the city. Kindelfresser's origins are contentious. He may represent Kronos, the Titan king, who, according to Greek mythology, ate 5 of his children. Another unfortunate possibility is that the Child Eater reflects the 16th century belief that Jews murdered children to use their blood for religious rituals. Kindelfresser's yellow pointed hat is strikingly familiar to the headwear that Jews wore at the time. Whatever the Child Eater of Bern was originally intended to represent, his wide eyes, grotesque face, and sack of screaming infants makes for a unique city fountain. Next is something I can pronounce, Le Musée des Grenouilles in Estavayer-le-Lac, Fribourg. Estavayer, anyway. This museum in the medieval town of Estavayer-le-Lac caters to 2 interests, frogs and guns. During the mid-1800s, eccentric artist François Perrier stuffed over 100 frogs and arranged them into tableaux, replicating everyday scenes, including a barber shop, a billiards game, a feast, and a rousing round of dominoes. The taxidermy scenes are in a room attached to an armory that contains firearms and military equipment dating from the Middle Ages through the early 20th century. The relationship between the two rooms, if any, is not clear. And lastly, we have the Abbey Library of St. Gall in St. Gallen. There are beautiful old libraries, and then there is the Abbey Library of St. Gall. Architectural plans for the library attached to the main church date back to the 9th century. As the abbey grew over the years, so did its library. Soon the site became known for its collection of illuminated manuscripts and writings, as well as becoming a leading center for science and Western culture between the 6th and 9th centuries. In the mid-18th century, the world-renowned collection was moved to a new library space lavishly decorated in Rococo style. Elaborate artworks were installed in the ceiling, framed by flowing curved moldings. The wooden balconies are adorned with flowering shapes and designs. Today, the library at St. Gall is still considered today unrivaled in its beauty. It also holds one of the more important collections in the world, covering 12 centuries. The collection even includes the first examples of an architectural plan on parchment. It's beautiful. It's like a Beauty and the Beast library, huh? Gorgeous. Anyway, that's it for tonight. We'll head over to Eastern Europe next time. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video relaxing and educational, and I hope that you have a very good night.